Hi, I'm Max Kaiser. This is the Kaiser Report, coming to you from Mexico City, baby. Peyote? They got it. Have I done any? No. All right, what's up?
Yeah, actually, peyote is a very important cactus, I guess you call it, to the art here, the native art that goes back 1,000 years.
Oh yeah, you see those skulls with beads all over them, covering them? At the top, you see the hexagon, which is apparently a symbol for the peyote and the mind, so it expands the mind. And of course, I would never advocate any use of anything that's a controlled substance, but apparently, according to the culture here, you have some kind of consciousness-raising experience along with peyote and magic mushrooms and this type of thing, and who knows what it's all about. You got to come down to Mexico and check it out yourself.
It was the journey to the grandfather. That's what...
The peyote goes to the grandfather?
Yeah, and ayahuasca from down Latin, South America, goes to your grandmother. So, well, actually, grandparents might be quite important to this story I want to cover here, because you and I had been walking around with Jeff Berwick of the Dollar Vigilante and Anarcho-Pulco, and we noted in the park, and he'll be in the second half, but we noted in the park and throughout the city, walking around Mexico City while we've been here, just how many kids are running around on their own, just having fun, doing all sorts of things, skateboarding. Like much younger kids, you might see kids skateboarding in New York or London, and they'll be like 16, 17, 18. I'm talking about like 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old kids just walking around, playing, doing things that when you and I were kids, it was acceptable in America to have free time on your own. And the reason why I mention this is because it's quite important to this studies coming out in America where they ask, is American childhood creating an authoritarian society? Overprotective parenting is a threat to democracy. American childhood has taken an authoritarian turn. An army of trends in American society are conspiring to produce unprecedented levels of supervision and control over children's lives. Tracing the effects of child rearing on broad social outcomes is an exercise in speculation, but if social scientists are correct to posit a connection between child rearing and long-term political outcomes, today's restrictive childhood norms may portend a broader regression in our country's democratic consensus.
Authoritarianism bred by mollycoddling children is the claim which seems to be borne out by the British aristocracy. You have a certain trend toward priggishness, for sure, because of the need to kind of foster a culture of inbrededness and authoritarian worshiping. And look what's happening there. The thing is in collapse. It's in free fall. So I would concur with your finding, Professor.
Well, okay, we're going to go through a number of details here, but in terms of the millennial generation, a lot of people have been focusing on, for example, these sort of snowflakes, as they're being called, college students shrieking at the notion of any sort of professor having an opinion that they don't want to hear and needing safe spaces. That's also part of this trend towards authoritarianism. But in terms of how we got to there, and we're going to go more into those college student snowflakes, left wing, because I bring that up because most people think authoritarianism is unique to the right wing, and it is part of the right wing, but it's also part of the left wing. But since the early 1980s, American childhood has been marked by a turn towards stringent adult control. Support for free-range childhood has given way to a flight to safety characterized by unprecedented dictates over children's routines. More so than any other generation, parents and educators have instilled in millennials the idea that, as Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt put it, quote, life is dangerous, but adults will do everything in their power to protect you from harm. Indeed, strong social pressures have so hardened against parents who believe in the value of a free, unsupervised childhood that psychologist Peter Gray likens them to past Chinese norms on foot binding. And they give some hard data to show the trend, what life was like different for me and you when I was a child in the 70s or you were a child in the 60s. They have actual raw data to show what is different between our childhoods and those who are growing up in the 2000s and the teens now. The amount of free time school-aged children enjoyed has plummeted from 40% of their time at school in the early 1980s to 25% by the mid-1990s. The time young children spend in school jumped from 5 to 6 hours in the early 80s to almost 7 hours beginning in the early 2000s. And by 2006, some 40% of schools had either eliminated recess or were consider doing that. So 40% of schools have no recess. That was my favorite class of the day.
Right. So I understand this. So when we see on television left-wing, let's say advocates, left-wingers out there, and they're shutting down professors from speaking at colleges, or they're shutting down colleges. This is an example of them being or acting in an authoritarian fashion. They become little dictators.
Yes.
And this is linked to the fact that as children, they were completely shielded from any of the so-called dangers of life, kept in a bubble. And so when they become young adults, anything that disrupts that bubble, a loud sound, a professor saying something that doesn't agree with them, they go into shock, they go into snowflake meltdown, and they behave like little dictators, and they're shutting down universities. And so this is based on a childhood that's been attacked from an over reliance on keeping kids completely divorced from reality.
It's partly helicopter parenting, and we're also going to talk about the right wing, and there was the number one determinant for who voted for Donald Trump. It wasn't about economic policy, it wasn't about trade deals, it wasn't about racism or anything. The number one predictor that you could guarantee you knew who was going to vote for Trump was how what they thought about how children should behave, what sort of independence a child should have. So the more authoritarian sort of mindset did vote for Donald Trump. So we have it on both the right and left in America, but part of this childhood authoritarianism is also part of just like ordinary things. So like when you were little, did you play with Play-Doh? Yes. Did you play with things that like your mom just gave you it's like a lump of clay, here, just go have fun, right? And you could spend hours playing with your Play-Doh. Now it's much more structured through video games who create the world for you. They guide you through, they provide the imagination. You're not doing it as the child, the 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old. So when you were a child, Max, you didn't have video games to turn to. You didn't have amazing amount of online content to turn to. You didn't have thousands of hours of television shows to watch on Netflix. Your mother would tell you, little Max, go outside and figure out what to do. If you're bored, go find something to do. So you had to come up with your own ideas and invent things, and learn how to occupy yourself. That was part of creating yourself.
Who was great to foretell this future was Charles Schulz, who created the Peanuts cartoon. Remember Snoopy and Linus and Lucy? And I remember one of the strip, and I read this as a child, and I remember it distinctly, that Linus picked up a rubber band, and he stretched it a little bit, and then Lucy comes over to watch him. And then Linus starts to really have fun with this rubber band, like he's having fun, like the time of his life. And then Lucy grabs it and walks away. She's an authoritarian.
She was.
Lucy's a dictator.
She was always pulling the football away from him.
She pulls a football away from Charlie Brown. Okay? She was essentially Pol Pot of children's cartoons.
So it's making them authoritarian, but it's an authoritarian mindset, but it's also all this sheltering of the child in the home has a lot to do with stranger danger fear. So I'll recount a personal story. So we go to visit my mother, my stepfather in North Carolina, down near the coast. We go there all the time, several times a year for years, and I assumed it was like a retirement community because I had never seen any kids. So it was only a month or two ago where we were driving out of their house at around 2 or 3 p.m. and a school bus stops and all these kids got off. And I was like, there are kids in this neighborhood? I haven't seen them in all these years here. It's right on the lake. They're not playing on the lake. They're not out on their boats like we used to do. They're not doing any of this sort of stuff that we used to do as a kid. I mean, there is an alligator in the lake. So
yeah, that's right. There was a big alligator that, of course, wouldn't bite you out of professional courtesy, but, the other kids might be not so lucky.
But in terms of their health, Consider that practically every declining health outcome in children can be traced to the sedentary, indoor, micromanaged lives that now define American childhood. In a 2005 pediatric study, researchers from the University of Pennsylvania found that children with mothers fearful of neighborhood safety are more likely to watch television for over 2 hours per day instead of playing outside. When American students are moving for only 18 minutes per day at school, it's hardly a surprise that we've seen since the 1970s a more than threefold increase in the number of overweight 6 to 11-year-olds. So their health outcomes are going to be worse just based on this fear of letting your child, take their own risks, learn, make their own mistakes, make bad choices, have imagination, the fear of what they might miss out on something.
Well, I was in Los Angeles, 10 years ago, and I was on rollerblades, and I fell, hit my head, it was bleeding. This woman drives by and says, "Are you going to be okay?" And I said, "I don't know." She said, "Well, I would take you to the hospital, but I might get sued, so I have to leave."
Yeah, well, then the article goes on to say that the impact on children is concerning in itself, but to society at large, authoritarianism is not a good place to be for any society. And psychologist Alice Miller said that the antidote to this authoritarianism, she was an expert on the authoritarian mindset. She's now passed, but she says that is childhood autonomy. To give your child autonomy helps fix this. And I want to move quickly in the last minute here to the snowflakes that we mentioned at universities in America. Few institutions in American society have embraced authoritarianism as decisively in recent years as academia, the arena where helicoptered millennials increasingly get their first taste of independence. Since 2000, at least 240 campaigns have been launched at universities to prevent appearances by public figures, most of which have occurred since 2009. Behind these authoritarian efforts are an army of, quote, chief diversity officers, 75 of whom have been hired between 2015 and 2016 at colleges and universities. Their mandate: train students against, quote, subtle insults, quote, environmental microaggressions, and, quote, micro-invalidations. In this insurgence of political correctness, New York Magazine columnist Jonathan Chait sees not simply a rigorous commitment to social equality, but rather an undemocratic creed and a system of left-wing ideological repression.
Well, professors are naturally paranoid because they can't believe they get paid essentially to do nothing. But if you want to look into the future, I suggest rent the movie Boys from Brazil, which is, if you recall, all about the cloning of Hitler. That's what America's become. Well, we got to go now to the second half. Thank you.
Thank you.